Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're quite pleased to be hosting Adam Hochschild. He's here to talk about his new book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. This is at least, I think, Adam's eighth appearance at Politics and Prose. The first was 22 years ago, and we're always delighted to welcome him back. It also helps my role as host when on the day someone like him is scheduled to appear, the New York Times highlights his book on the front of their book review section, which is what happened today. It's a very favorable review, and its prominent display underscores the importance of Adam's new work, which offers a timely and insightful reassessment of the repressive events in the United States after this country entered World War I in 1917 and in the few years that followed. That was a dark and tumultuous time for American democracy when the foundations of our country were threatened by war, pandemic, and violence, rooted in battles over race, immigration, and the rights of labor. And if that sounds familiar, that's the point. Because many of us, of course, today consider our democracy under threat, and it is. But the period a century ago explored in Adam's book arguably was as unsettling and scary and transformative as the present day. Back then, the government of Woodrow Wilson made a sharp turn towards authoritarianism. There was a crackdown on opposition. Dissent became a criminal offense. Many newspapers and magazines were forced to close. The Socialist Party suffered mass jailings. Mobs burned black churches to the ground. And there were all too many other instances of racism, nativism, red baiting, and contempt for the rule of law. Now, anyone who knows Adam's previous works won't be surprised that he decided to tackle this shameful period in American history. He's tended to be drawn to times and places in the past involving people wrestling with profound political and moral dilemmas and feeling an imperative to confront evil. He's written about apartheid in South Africa in The Mirror at Midnight, Stalin's prison camps in The Unquiet Ghost, the exploitative regime that King Leopold II of Belgium imposed on the Congo in King Leopold's Ghost, efforts to end slavery in the British Empire in Bury the Chains. I have to catch my breath here. Resistance to the madness of the First World War and to end all wars. American volunteers and journalists getting caught up in the Spanish Civil War in Spain in our hearts, and a Jewish refugee from Russia, Rose Pastor Stokes, who married an heir to an American fortune and became one of the most charismatic socialist leaders of her time in Rebel Cinderella. 4 years ago, in Lessons from a Dark Time and Other Essays, Adam provided a collection of pieces meant to serve as a response to the threat of Donald Trump's presidency and to the resurgence of authoritarianism elsewhere in the world. His new book should help us reckon further in this regard. A review in Kirkus called the book a riveting, resonant account of the fragility of freedom, and Publishers Weekly commended it as a timely reminder of the vigilant respect for civil rights and constitutional safeguards needed to protect democracy and forestall authoritarianism. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Adam Hochschild.
So, thank you, Brad. It's great to be back here at this wonderful store. I think you're right. It feels like at least my eighth time here. I remember what I think was the very first time There were 6 people in the audience, 4 of whom were relatives of mine. So maybe things have improved for me to some degree since then. Anyway, in talking about this book, I'd like to begin by asking you to think about some of the most dramatic and shocking events of the last couple of years. A president who tried to steal an election, the January 6th of last year assault on the Capitol, the killing of George Floyd on video, a string of appalling Supreme Court decisions. But imagine if 100 years from now, you were reading a history of the United States in this period, and there was little or nothing said about any of this. I think that's the case when we look at the way the standard high school history textbook treats the America of a century ago. There were equally shocking things that happened then, but we've forgotten about them and at our peril. Now, maybe not everybody here went to high school in the United States, but for those of you who did, think back to your high school history textbook. Those of you who didn't go to high school in the United States, here's a little lesson in American mythology. There was a chapter on the First World War, when the nations of the old world started tearing each other apart, while the United States, meanwhile, was a country at peace, a country of small-town churchgoers, new industries, and hardworking farmers. Then the nasty Germans started sinking American ships. President Woodrow Wilson said, "Enough is enough. We need to make the world safe for democracy," and Congress declared war. Then those American troops went to Europe, the doughboys in those forest ranger hats. They fought bravely. They helped win the war. And then that chapter of the textbook, or at least my high school textbook, ended. You turn the page, and the next chapter of American history begins. The Roaring Twenties. Flappers, the Charleston, Prohibition, speakeasies, and the heyday of Babe Ruth. But what I want to talk about and what I've tried to write about in this book is the missing chapter between those two. Now, I said that the image of the United States before it went to war in April 1917 was that it was a peaceful country. But it was not. It was a tinderbox of tension with 3 big conflicts going on. One was between capital and labor. Routinely, dozens of people were killed in labor strife each year. In 1913 and 14 alone, more than 70 people were killed in a battle over a miners' strike in Colorado. The second tension that was dividing the United States was between nativists and immigrants. You can see some of that reflected in this sign and in this one. And the third major conflict going on was between white and black Americans. Most black Americans were doing miserable, low-paid work like picking cotton as sharecroppers, and most white people wanted to keep them in such jobs. So these were some of the tensions in this not very peaceful country of ours a little over 100 years ago. When the U.S. entered the First World War in 1917, it was like pouring gasoline on 3 sets of flames. There was a frenzy of hyper-patriotism. These are Boy Scouts running down Fifth Avenue in New York. From the moment the U.S. entered the war, came a fierce propaganda barrage from the government. This is a U.S. Army recruiting poster. There was also great paranoia about spies, which mixed with some of the ethnic hostilities. Now, if you look at this particular poster, it's clearly... Actually, Brad, is there anything we could do to make the picture a little bigger if we pull back the slide projector? Can people in the back see okay? You can see okay? All right, then let's not worry about it.
It's really an eye
All right. And there are more seats in the front if anybody wants to come down there. Anyway, look at this poster about don't say anything that can be overheard by spies. It's clearly a German helmet with that little spike on the top, but perhaps a Jewish nose. Now, I heard about the atmosphere of these times from my father, who was 25 years old in 1917. He was the son of a Jewish immigrant from Germany, and they all spoke German at home around the dining room table, but they were terrified of doing so on the street because you could get beaten up for doing so. Schools and colleges stopped teaching German. Several states passed laws against speaking German in public or on the telephone, and signs like this one appeared this one is at a park in Chicago. There were literally dozens of bonfires of German books. This one was outside a high school in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Robert Prager was a miner in Collinsville, Illinois, who had the bad luck to be German-born. One day, he was seized by a drunken mob, wrapped in an American flag, forced to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, and lynched. Here are the people who lynched him. They were put on trial. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes and found them innocent, while a military band played in the courthouse rotunda. Anti-German hysteria showed itself in other ways as well. There was no more Mendelssohn wedding march at weddings, for instance. Names changed. Berlin, Iowa became Lincoln. East Germantown, Indiana became Pershing. Families named Schmidt became Smith. And one change still with us, the Frankfurter became the hot dog. And there was ferocity in the air at absolutely the highest level. This, for instance, is Elihu Root, former Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Senator from New York, now in 1917 a special emissary for President Wilson, the absolute epitome of WASP, Wall Street to Washington respectability. He told an audience in New York in the summer of 1917 that pro-German traitors were threatening the war effort. There are, and I'm quoting him, men walking about the streets of this city tonight who ought to be taken out at sunrise tomorrow and shot. There are some newspapers published in this city every day, the editors of which deserve execution for treason. Now, people like him were as fierce as they were about the war because there was considerable resistance to it. A very interesting chapter of American history, and Michael Kazin, who's here, has written a whole book about it. Many people in the United States felt that it was a terrible mistake for the U.S. to join this conflict in Europe, which was clearly going to remake the world for the worse in every conceivable way. There was a group called the Women's Peace Party who agitated against the war. There were anti-war songs like this one, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. There were publications who took a strong stand against the war. One of them was a magazine called The Masses, really the liveliest magazine in America at the time. It was left-leaning but not doctrinaire. It published John Reed, Walter Lippmann, Sherwood Anderson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, many of the best writers of the day. In some ways, it was a precursor of the New Yorker, mixture of reportage, fiction, developed the New Yorker style of cartoon where you have a drawing with one line of dialogue as the caption. One of many people who spoke out against the war was Eugene Debs, the perennial socialist candidate for president, who at one point had won 6% of the popular vote. Another strong anti-war voice was Emma Goldman, the charismatic anarchist leader, who started organizing against the draft. 6 U.S. senators voted against the war, the most outspoken of whom was Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. And he asked, if this is a war to make the world safe for democracy, why not self-determination for Ireland, for Egypt, for India, all of which, of course, were colonies of our ally, Great Britain? La Follette began receiving nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy at his alma mater, the University of Wisconsin, and other senators opened an investigation over whether he should be expelled from the Senate. Debs and Goldman had worse fates, and we'll come back to them. The government moved quickly to suppress anti-war demonstrations. People who refused the draft, refused military service, were sent to prison or locked up in very harsh army detention camps like this one. And in those camps, if they refused to do the manual labor required of them, they were shackled to their cell bars for the 8 hours a day that they were supposed to be working. And this drawing was made by an artist from that magazine, The Masses, who himself endured this as a prisoner. The government crackdown on dissent had a lot of help from vigilantes. Organizations sprang up around the country, the largest of which was something called the American Protective League. Members got to wear badges like this, and you may not be able to read the writing in the middle ring on the badge, but it says auxiliary to the U.S. Department of Justice, because this organization was organized with Department of Justice support. By the end of 1917, there were more than 200,000 members of the American Protective League, soon more than 250,000 members. Most of them were men who were a little too old to fight, but who still wanted to feel that they were patriotically fighting the war at home. One of the things they did was to carry out what they called slacker raids to find people who had not registered for the draft. Sometimes also a slacker was somebody who refused to buy a war bond. But slacker raids by the American Protective League were the comparatively mild side of vigilante violence in these years. Other expressions of it were much worse. Here's one such episode. The men referred to in this headline, beaten, tarred, and feathered, were Wobblies, members of the country's most militant labor union, the Industrial Workers of the World, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They were severely beaten, tarred, and feathered. And what the article doesn't say is that one of the leaders of the masked vigilantes who carried out this action was the local police chief, who had tipped off the newspaper editor in advance so he could be there and write about it. Here's what it looks like when you're tarred and feathered. The guy in this picture was a Minnesota farmer who had refused to buy war bonds. The men who attacked him were put on trial but found innocent. Someone else, an organizer for the Wobblies, had a worse fate. He was seized from his bed in the middle of the night in Butte, Montana, and hanged from a railroad bridge outside of town. Frank Little, 38 years old, his crime was coming to organize workers for the Wobblies in a mining town where some weeks earlier there had been an underground fire that had taken the lives of more than 160 miners. Which brings us to the point that the real target of repression during the war years was not only draft evaders or alleged pro-Germans, it was organized labor. This was an era of expanding unions and many strikes. Business was desperate to suppress unions. For this, they sometimes had cooperation from state militia and federal troops, or by the police. That's a striking garment worker in Chicago being arrested. The war gave the federal government and business the perfect excuse to crack down on the left and on organized labor because they could say, you strikers are impeding the war effort. And then something happened that inflamed tensions still more. The Russian Revolution. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, the most militant faction of the Russian left, seized power. That set off further hysteria here. The American establishment was terrified at the prospect of the Russian Revolution spreading to the United States, and combined with the patriotic fervor over World War I, this produced, I think, the worst repression in the U.S. since the immediate aftermath of slavery. And it took several forms. One was censorship on an enormous scale. This August 1917 cover of The Masses, this was the last issue that magazine ever printed. It was printed, but it was banned from the U.S. mail, which meant they had no means of distributing it. Why? Because censors objected to several pieces of text and several cartoons. Here's one of the cartoons they didn't like, the Liberty Bell crumbling. So the best magazine in the country was forced to cease publishing. This was America's chief press censor, Albert S. Burleson. He was the Postmaster General, and the law gave him the power to declare a magazine or newspaper unmailable. And of course, for anything other than a daily newspaper, monthlies, weeklies, journals of opinion, the vast majority of foreign language publications, the mail was essential to distribution. You know, this was way pre-internet, of course. Burleson was a former congressman from Texas, very right-wing, an arch segregationist, and he loved being chief censor. Between 1917 and early 1921, he banned more than 400 specific issues of American newspapers and magazines from being mailed, and some 75 different publications he forced to shut down entirely. With his hatred of dissenting media, he would have been very much at home in the Trump administration, and ironically, he managed this whole censorship operation from post office headquarters, which a century later became the Trump International Hotel, right here in Washington. Another front on which the government moved was to jail critics of the war. This is Eugene Debs. Here he is as a federal prisoner, sentenced for an anti-war speech to 10 years in prison. Something else the government was eager to do was to suppress the Socialist Party, which Debs was the leader of, so they jailed him and many other of its leaders. And like many war critics, Debs was still in jail 2 years after the war ended, in November 1920, when, as a convict in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, prisoner number 9653, he was again socialist candidate for president and received more than 900,000 votes. He was far from the only person sent to jail for speaking against the war. One of hundreds of others was the Socialist Party's most popular woman speaker, Kate Richards O'Hare, a fiery activist and orator from Kansas. And when she was sent to prison, she found herself in the very next cell to Emma Goldman, whom we talked about earlier. And the two women became close friends, and they each wrote about their memories of the other. And for me, writing history is all about people. And when two of your people record their impressions of each other, it's really a writer's dream. If you want to get into the history books, by the way, keep diaries, write letters, write your memoirs. That's the kind of raw material we work from. Goldman served nearly 2 years in prison, but after that, the government deployed another weapon against her. It deported her from the United States. On this ship, along with 248 other radicals the government wanted to get rid of, expelled from the country forever. And remember, all this was happening under Woodrow Wilson. And I think the lesson there is that you don't have to be a loudmouth demagogue to preside over repression. Wilson was the most genteel, scholarly, and dignified president imaginable. The author of a dozen books, friend of many writers, former university president. yet he oversaw one of the greatest assaults on American civil liberties that we have ever seen. It continued to be a stormy time in other ways as well. The war ended, but during it the cost of living had soared and wages hadn't caught up. In 1919 came the biggest strike wave in American history. 1 in 5 American workers went on strike at some point during that year. These are police in Massachusetts who, as you can see, are armed with a machine gun at the site of a textile workers' strike. And later that year, the Boston police themselves went on strike, something that had never happened before. 1919 was also a year of some of the worst racial violence in American history because there were 380,000 returning Black war veterans, and they were competing for jobs with nearly 4 million returning white war veterans. And the jobs were scarce because war industries had shut down. Nobody was making tanks and shells and artillery and rifles and so on anymore. Furthermore, it was a time when, for nearly a decade by this point, Black Americans had been fleeing the South, an area where there was often as much as an average of a lynching a week, looking for safety. They had headed north in the Great Migration, but often met more violence there. These are white people in Chicago, the summer of 1919, stoning to death a Black man. Federal troops on the streets of Chicago that same summer questioning a Black man. Lynchings took place in the North, too. The mayor of Omaha, who's mentioned in this headline, had quite bravely intervened to try to stop a lynching. The crowd seized him. Police managed to cut him down unconscious just in time, but the man he was trying to save was not so lucky. He was lynched and his body was burned. Martial law was declared in Omaha and in several other American cities. In the year 1919, more than 70 Black Americans were lynched, the highest total in over a decade, and the total death toll of 1919 race warfare was in the high hundreds. All but a handful of the dead were Black. There's no accurate death toll because the largest single outburst of violence was in Arkansas, where Blacks in Arkansas were being slaughtered both by local vigilantes and by federal troops because they were trying to organize a sharecroppers union. And the bodies of many of those killed were simply tossed into the Mississippi and floated downstream. And there's no accurate count, but most people believe the death toll there was well into the hundreds. Something else was going on that feels eerily familiar today. The U.S. was swept by a frenzy about deporting people. The leading candidates for both the Republican and Democratic presidential nominations in 1920 were campaigning on promises of mass deportations. On the Republican side, the leading contender was General Leonard Wood, a blood and thunder type who was, incidentally, the commander of those troops on the streets in Omaha. Meanwhile, the frontrunner for the 1920 Democratic nomination was the Attorney General, Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was determined not to be outdone as a law and order candidate. He staged the notorious Palmer raids, which in more than 30 cities sent federal agents, often accompanied by local police and civilian vigilantes, to arrest thousands of radicals. Palmer was looking for people he hoped could be deported because they were not yet American citizens. Here are some of the Palmer raid victims rounded up and awaiting deportation, ironically, at Ellis Island, previously a place of hope, a place through which many of our ancestors first arrived in the United States. In these raids, the police also seized and destroyed left-wing literature of all kinds. These are federal agents and local police in Boston. And they trashed the offices of the progressive groups they raided. This is the New York City office of the Wobblies. They were proud of having done this and invited newspaper photographers to come and take pictures of their handiwork. There was, however, a very interesting, unexpected hero of this dark time, a man named Louis F. Post, who was acting Secretary of Labor. Post had previously been a progressive journalist and magazine editor in Chicago. He was the number 3 person at the Labor Department. In the spring of 1920, the Secretary of Labor was on sick leave. The Assistant Secretary of Labor had resigned to run for Congress, and Post became acting Secretary of Labor. He was a longtime progressive. These arrests that I spoke about were carried out by the Justice Department, but deportations had to be approved by the Labor Department because the Labor Department housed the Immigration Bureau. And Post was outraged by this because he thought nobody should be deported from the United States because of their political opinions. He was a skillful bureaucrat, an experienced lawyer, and an ardent believer in civil liberties. He found legal problems with the arrest warrants, he invalidated them, got most of the people awaiting deportation out of jail, and was able to save several thousand people from being deported. These actions infuriated the real architect of the Palmer raids, J. Edgar Hoover, then 24 years old, the head of the radical division of the Justice Department. He was enraged. He prepared a dossier against Post. He got the American Legion to demand Post's firing. He got Congress to investigate Post, but Post held on. And Hoover lost that battle. Post stayed in office until the last day of the Wilson administration. But Hoover went on to, as we know, win many, many other battles. And he really got his start in these years. He greatly enlarged government infiltration and surveillance of radical groups, something that would last for a century to come. I got my FBI files under the Freedom of Information Act, and probably some of you here have done the same thing. He told the country he was monitoring dangerous progressives and radicals of all kinds. For example, men like these that you can see on the front page of a newspaper in Pittsburgh. A story about some people arrested in an alleged bomb plot by the Wobblies, the IWW. 3 suspects, and the supposed kingpin of the plot was the man at the upper right. Pittsburgh radicals knew him as Louis Walsh. He was the secretary of the local Wobbly branch. He was active in the city's radical library. He was on the strike committee for a big steel strike, a member of other left-wing organizations as well, a friend of local socialists. And he was violent. During a streetcar driver's strike, Walsh and a fellow Wobbly jubilantly beat a strikebreaker unconscious. That's the beating referred to in the headline. So somebody obviously suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. But the whole time, he was really Agent 836 of the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor of the FBI, periodically slipping away to meet Hoover in Washington and New York and brief him. Some of what the Pittsburgh Wobblies were accused of doing was instigated by him. And today, you can read all his reports to Hoover in the National Archives, which is back in the news again. Walsh was exposed a couple of years later. A labor newspaper blew his cover. He surfaced and had a long career above ground. Here he is as a lieutenant colonel in intelligence in the Michigan National Guard. Another aspect of those years, 1917 to 21, is that not only did the Justice Department greatly increase its undercover actions against progressive activists of all sorts, but so did the U.S. military. Military intelligence in that era thought very much in ethnic terms. Italians might be anarchists, Jews might be socialists or communists, the Irish might be Irish Republican Army supporters, and Black Americans were an all-round threat. Here's a reflection of the Army's way of thinking. It's an ethnic map of New York City prepared by military intelligence in 1919. It shows the northeastern corner of Manhattan, and it's color-coded by where people of dangerous ethnicities lived. Red means Russian Jews, brown is for Italians, dark gray for Black people, bluish for Irish. The numbers on the map, with the little red circles around them, refer to union halls, IWW offices, and other meeting places. The blue stars with the numbers on them are the offices of suspicious publications, such as labor union newspapers and even the Journal of the NAACP, which at that time was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. Military intelligence was so fearful of an uprising that the Army prepared a contingency plan for putting the United States under martial law, complete with the wording of the proclamation the president should issue when that happened. Happily, things did not reach that point, but it's a reminder of how close to the brink we came. Gradually, the repression eased. There were demonstrations urging the release of those in jail. The people in this picture are in front of the White House. In 1921, Warren Harding became president, and at last, in response to those demonstrations and other pressures, he gradually let almost all the remaining political prisoners out of jail. He felt it safe to do because Woodrow Wilson's repression had accomplished its purpose. It had crippled the labor movement, the Socialist Party, progressive forces of all kinds. It's remarkable and it's appalling to realize just how many political prisoners there were. During the period of greatest frenzy from April 1917 until Wilson left office in March 1921, roughly 1,000 Americans went to jail for a year or more, and a far larger number for shorter periods of time, solely for things they wrote or said. One of those, of course, was Eugene Debs. Harding finally released him after 2.5 years in prison, and Harding even invited him to come for a visit on his way home. Here is Debs leaving Harding's office after that visit. He joked that he'd run for president 5 times, but this was the first time he'd actually gotten to the White House. So what can we conclude about this era? I think it's a reminder of the dark currents that have long run below the surface in this country and sometimes above the surface. Xenophobia, an eagerness to hunt for scapegoats, vigilante justice, racism, and more. And those currents are still there today. And it's a reminder of how vigilant we have to be about how easily democracy can be eroded when a crisis strikes. Back then, it was the shock of entering the First World War and then the Russian Revolution. We can't predict what the next crisis is going to be, but there will be one. I want to finish by just reading you a few things that Emma Goldman said when she was put on trial in 1917 and sentenced to 2 years in prison for organizing against the draft. Gentlemen of the jury, she said, remember, no women on juries in those days. Gentlemen of the jury, we respect your patriotism, but may there not be different kinds of patriotism? Our patriotism is that of the man who loves a woman with open eyes. He is enchanted by her beauty, yet he sees her faults. So we too, who know America, love her beauty, her richness, her great possibilities. Above all, do we love her great apostles who dream and work for liberty, but with the same passionate emotion, we hate her cant and her corruption. It was a good definition of patriotism then, and I think it still is today. So, thank you. So if you've got comments or questions, I'd be glad to hear them. And I guess you're supposed to go to the microphone there because everything is being recorded. But not recorded for the National Archives.
I mentioned this to you just before this began, so you didn't comment on the First Amendment. Could you say something, I don't know if the book covers it, how the First Amendment and freedom of speech, freedom of press played into this, and whether you think were this to be repeated, maybe it has been repeated, 100 years later, First Amendment protections might have a better outcome?
I actually think, on a positive note, that one thing that has changed in this country in the last 100 years or so is that there is a stronger respect for the First Amendment than there was back then. For example, one organization that was formed in this period, it actually originated to defend draft resistors who were in jail. After that was over in 1920 or 21, it changed its name to the American Civil Liberties Union, and it has had an enormous influence ever since. There are a lot of things to be worried about in the United States right now, and I don't need to list them because, we're all familiar with them, from the election deniers in charge of elections on down. But I do feel that there's more respect among most of the American population, not all of it by a long shot, but most of the American population for the First Amendment than there was a century ago, and that for all its faults, despite Fox News and everything, the best of the American mass media today is ready to be more critical of those in power than it was 100 years ago. Those of us who sort of came up through the field of journalism are always mourning the fact that there's only a fraction of the number of daily newspapers published in the U.S. today than there were 100 years ago, even though the population of the country is much smaller. But I spent a lot of time reading daily newspapers in writing this book, and the daily newspapers of a century ago were terrible. I mean, not every single one, but most of them. And even the papers that we respect so much today, and that I respect for a lot of what they do, the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, back then they just repeated shamelessly the lies that J. Edgar Hoover and A. Mitchell Palmer and other people told them. So I think our mass media has become a little more critical, and I think that reflects a greater respect for the First Amendment. But we're going to need that and a whole lot more to guard against, something like all this happening again. Yeah.
Did the Supreme Court weigh in on anything that was going on?
They did, and in a terrible way. There were a couple of decisions, one of which I won't go into all the details because court decisions are complicated, but one of which essentially said that there was no right to publish, dissenting opinions and so forth against the war. And then two of the justices, Holmes and Brandeis, had second thoughts. And a case came before the Supreme Court, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in 1919, the Abrams case, involving jail sentences for some people who had tossed leaflets out the window of a factory in New York City. Leaflets protesting Wilson sending American troops to suppress the Reds in the Russian Civil War. And 7 of the justices voted to affirm these sentences. And Holmes and Brandeis dissented. And Supreme Court dissents, of course, don't make law. But one of Holmes's biographers says that what Holmes said in his dissent is probably the most quoted justification of freedom of speech in American law. So that was the extent to which the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court was not noble in this period.
Okay.
Fortunately.
It all sounds horrendous, of course, not to mention familiar. But something must have changed over the course of the 20s because FDR didn't do any of those things. I mean, and the labor unions were there to recognize. So whether all the terrible people died, but there was something there. The labor unions came back. They were there and ready. The whole kind of thing changed because Hoover was not a bad guy and Keynes was not all that well known. Mm-hmm. So what do you think happened to bring about, it wasn't, a huge change and it wasn't a sudden change, but it was a significant difference?
Well, it's a good question. What made us get rid of this period, and can we do something like that to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? I think it's hard to make an exact analogy to today, but a couple of things happened. I think more than anything else, the event that sort of took the steam out of the Red Scare of this period was this. Attorney General Palmer, who, as I say, was up until the last minute was the leading contender for the Democratic nomination for president in 1920, was, as somebody, I can't remember who, but I quoted them in the book, said, a demagogue who believed his own demagoguery. And he, for weeks, was repeatedly predicting that on May 1st, 1920, right, May Day, the International Workers' Holiday, there would be a nationwide communist uprising. He kept repeating this. And they put the National Guard on alert. In New York City, they called out all 3 shifts of the police force. One shift was on the street. The others were all waiting in station houses. J.P. Morgan hired extra security men. They posted guards all over the country at railway stations and, ferry terminals and everything else. Everybody was waiting, and then it was announced that, Palmer's top people were going to go to New York, which, of course, was going to be the center of this uprising, New York being what it is. And everyone waited with bated breath, and absolutely nothing happened. And the press felt hoodwinked by Palmer because they had repeated all this crap that he was saying again and again and again. And then for the first time, they began to publish cartoons making fun of him and so on. And it also took the steam out of his presidential run. And after a long, tumultuous convention, finally the nomination went to somebody else. So that kind of lessened the hysteria dramatically, although it didn't get the political prisoners out of jail. A lot of them remained there until after the Wilson administration ended, and Harding released them, almost all of them gradually. The last were released by Coolidge after Harding had died and was no longer president. The other thing that happened, I think, and the labor movement was gravely weakened. Even the American Federation of Labor, which was resolutely moderate, lost 1 million members during this period. Because it was not just this repression at the federal level. There were a lot of state laws that came into being during this time that made it much harder to organize unions. In 1932, by the time Roosevelt came to power, we'd endured several years of the Great Depression. Everybody knew there was a crisis. Roosevelt had the wisdom to recognize that there was a crisis, and he was much more friendly towards labor organizing. And they passed some protections for unions of a kind that they didn't have before. And the unions really came back to life in a big way in the mid-1930s, in a way that they hadn't been for many years. So, I mean, there's a lot more that could be said, but that's the basics of it, I think.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm sure you know that the women's suffrage movement started virtually the day before Wilson was sworn in, and Alice Paul led a very different struggle for 7 years. He adamantly resisted it, and just as you said, other movements resulted in being beaten and jailed and brutalized. That happened to women too. And I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that parallel.
Well, I said there were, three big tensions that were going on in this period: business, labor, black, white, nativist, immigrant. In a way, a fourth tension was the centuries-old battle between men and women, by men to keep women in what men thought was their proper place. By 1918 or so, it was clear that women were going to get the vote. A lot of men were terrified by this, afraid of it. Something that I think accelerated those fears was that when the U.S. shifted to a war footing in early 1917, mobilizing more than 4 million men for the Army, women had to fill in, doing jobs in factories and driving streetcars and being firefighters and doing all sorts of things they'd never done before. And there are some surveys that showed that employers actually found that they did these jobs better. And this was something that terrified a lot of men. And I think it's no accident that some of the people, the anti-war dissenters on whom the government really concentrated its fire most harshly, were women. 3 of them, Kate Richards O'Hare, Emma Goldman, and Marie Equi, are characters in my book.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam.
Hey. As you know, World War I became very unpopular in retrospect by the 1920s. I wonder if you could reflect on whether the repression and some misgivings about it, which you mentioned, Harding, for example, has something to do with that along with the war, the U.S. doesn't join the League of Nations, and these empires that Wilson promised would be broken up and not broken up. I wonder what role the repression had in that, recoil against the war.
I think it had a big role, and you may know more about this than I do. Michael Kazan's book, War Against War, if I get the title right, is about the anti-war movement in the U.S. at that time. I think all over the world, there was something in common in many countries about the second thoughts about World War I. Everybody in Europe, first in Europe in 1914, then the United States in 1917, had gone to war with tremendous enthusiasm. We're going off to save democracy or save the German homeland or restore Russian honor and dignity or whatever the particular cause was, with enormous enthusiasm. And I'm sure all of you have read stuff about the mood of 1914 that way. By the time it was over, it was crystal clear that this war was a disaster for everybody. It killed more than 9 million soldiers. Depending on how you count them, perhaps a larger number of civilians. It was clear right from the moment it ended that the war was going to leave a reservoir of bitterness and resentment in Germany, which would lead to something terrible, which, of course, it did. And there were many people saying this openly, and sometimes not openly. And Harding told somebody in 1921, I can't remember exactly who, but again, the quote is in my book, that, but off the record, that Debs was right. We never should have been in that war. And I think that was I mean, and as I say, he invited Debs to visit him in the White House on his way home from prison, which was sort of, in a way, saying that publicly. And I think that probably had a lot to do with the easing of the repression, because the war had been the pretext for all of this stuff.
This is going to be the last question.
Well, history has a way of repeating itself. So are you implying that today perhaps our American democracy and liberty is kind of at risk, or
is there anybody in this room who would say it isn't at risk? Yeah, I think it really is at risk, and that we have to really be on the alert. And even without an immediate crisis right now that's a sort of an excuse for doing something, like we're going to war, or we've been invaded, or, you know, a 9/11 type attack or something, even without an immediate excuse, there are a lot of crazy people who are on the verge of being elected, or possibly elected. Think about if there was another attack like September 11th. And there will be things that we can predict for certain are going to happen. For example, over the coming years and decades, there will be, and there already is beginning, a northward migration of climate refugees, people coming from the equatorial parts of the world that are becoming too hot to live in. That's going to increase. It's impacting us. It's impacting Europe. You know, and both here and in Europe, you can see ways in which right-wing demagogues are using it. Who knows what else is coming, but we have to be alert to all possible threats and ready to face them. All right. Thank you.
Signing, please form a line to the right of the table and help our staff by folding up your chairs and leaning them against something solid. Thank you again for coming.